Good afternoon, and welcome. Thank you so much for joining us for SSP's 40th annual meeting, Scholarly Publishing at the Crossroads. What's working? What's holding us back? Where do we go from here? Over the next few days, there will be 36 sessions exploring answers to these questions, from sustainability and integration to new tools, and re-envisioning scholarly communications. Whether your focus is on practical skills, marketing, strategy, research, scholarship, or technology, we have sessions for you. We hope you'll take this opportunity to reflect on where we've been and consider the exciting opportunities and possibilities for where we can go. I'd like to introduce and thank our program chairs. So if you would please stand. Kason Lindley, Laura Ricci, and Ben Mudrak. You've put together, yes. You've put together an amazing program, and on occasions such as this, I wish that technology existed that would allow me to attend multiple concurrents simultaneously. Perhaps that is something that we can envision for our future. I'd also like to take this opportunity to thank our sponsors. Their support is critical in making this event so successful, and we truly appreciate it. Please visit our sponsors and our exhibitors during the opening reception in the exhibit hall that will follow our keynote. And thank you very much to our development chairs, Veronica Showers and Rebecca Shumbata. Many thanks to you, as well as the development committee and Kelly from Kellen that helped us secure such fantastic support. There are a few items to note that will make your conference experience more enjoyable, so here's where we do a little bit of housekeeping. If you haven't already, you can download the app. The instructions are in the program. Wi-Fi is available throughout the conference. The password is Aries 2018, and Aries is lowercase. If you need anything during the meeting, please stop by registration. We have fantastic staff there that will most certainly try and help you. Certain sessions, including our keynote session, are being live streamed for the virtual meeting option for our colleagues that couldn't join us in person. All sessions will be recorded and made available after the meeting through the SSP website. There is a headshot studio that is available throughout the conference. You can sign up at the registration desk. We actually recommend a $20 donation for headshots, and the donations will go to support our fellowship program. And if you tweet, the hashtag is #SSP2018. Pretty easy to remember that one. I'm especially honored to be opening our 2018 meeting, as this year also marks the 40th anniversary of the Society for Scholarly Publishing. 40 years ago. So what were some things that were happening 40 years ago? I thought this was pretty interesting. The Navstar Global Positioning System, GPS, was launched. The Illinois Bell Company introduced the first ever cellular mobile phone system. The first computer bulletin board was created. The first test tube baby was born. Minimum wage was $2.65. Home Depot was founded in Atlanta, Georgia. The top song was Night Fever by the Bee Gees. You always have to throw in that top song. And, this one's my personal favorite, the first Star Wars action figures were released. No, actually, this is my favorite. 16 individuals became the founding board members of the Society for Scholarly Publishing 40 years ago. Tomorrow at the awards luncheon, we'll recognize our founding members and hear from Barbara Myers Ford as she shares with us how our wonderful society became to be. Concurrent session 4G on Thursday afternoon is also a 40th anniversary session where past presidents and founders will share memories and experiences that have brought us to this point, and President-elect Adrian Stanley will offer a perspective on the next 40 years and what they might mean for us. Why has SSP remained so strong and relevant for 40 years? If you had the opportunity to read Ann Michaels' post on the Scholarly Kitchen yesterday, she asked the presidents, what surprised you most about SSP during your presidency? You might have noticed that there was a theme in the responses. Many past presidents said it was the level of volunteerism and the sense of community at SSP. Whether it's serving as a mentor, working with the fellows, putting in endless hours to develop an event such as this, sharing ideas through posts and comments in the Scholarly Kitchen, working on a task force to develop a new training program, or tackling broader issues such as equity and inclusion in our community. There are so many people who are passionate about what we do and who have come together through SSP as a part of this community. Former SSP President Howard Ratner commented in the post, "It's the people, the passionate people that want to learn from each other," and I couldn't agree more. This community has been invaluable to me for more than 15 years. I started my involvement attending and learning from the annual meeting. I was invited to speak at sessions and serve on committees. I found mentors and colleagues and friends in SSP. Anytime I had a question, I could, and I still can, reach out to my SSP network for guidance, and I attribute much of the success in my own career to SSP. Because I've received so much value from SSP, I've tried to give back as well through speaking, volunteering, shepherding a fellow or two, and serving on both the board and as president. And even while giving back in these activities, I still find myself on the receiving end in everything I do and learn and grow from every one of these interactions. I hope you've experienced the power of this community as well, or if this is your first experience with SSP, I hope the next few days will be an excellent introduction for you. There's an African proverb that says, if you want to go quickly, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. As we stand at these crossroads in scholarly publishing, I want to go together. And with that, I would like Kaysen Lindley to introduce our keynote speaker.
Good afternoon. I am very excited to introduce this afternoon's keynote speaker. When the annual program committee started considering potential keynotes, we looked at the feedback from the 2017 annual meeting survey. What we saw in the survey was that SSP attendees identified sessions addressing issues of diversity and inclusion as among the most important and valuable, and that they would like to see more programming centered on these topics. Anyone who has been reading Scholarly Kitchen posts or listening to today's news knows that the issues of diversity and inclusion are at the forefront of many discussions, both within the industry and outside of it. The second characteristic that the committee intentionally looked for in a keynote speaker was someone engaged in academic research and who could relate that research to scholarly publishing. Dr. Safiya Noble's experience perfectly fit all that we hope to find in the first keynote speaker kicking off the 40th anniversary of the annual meeting. Dr. Noble's work focuses on the ways that digital media impacts and intersects issues of race, gender, culture, and technology design. Now an assistant professor at the University of Southern California, Annenberg School of Communication, she was previously appointed to the Department of Information Studies, African American Studies, and Gender Studies at UCLA. Dr. Noble is also the co-founder of the Information Ethics and Equity Institute, which provides training for organizations committed to transforming their information management practices toward more just, ethical, and equitable outcomes. Her monograph on racist and sexist algorithmic bias is entitled Algorithms of Oppression: How Search Engines Reinforce Racism. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Safiya Noble.
Hi, everyone. This is a super amazing room to speak in. It's no pressure whatsoever when you have two giant screens that are showing your face. So that's what we're about to do here. As I plug in, I have been enjoying coming back to Chicago. I used to live in Champaign-Urbana. And those of you who know anything about the University of Illinois and Champaign-Urbana know that I am extremely thrilled to live in LA now. So we'll leave it there. Everyone keeps asking me, are you going down to Champaign while you're here in Chicago? And I'm like, hell no. No, I'm not. So sorry. That's the only H word I'm going to drop in the beginning. All right. So I am going to just say thank you, Kaysen, for that lovely introduction, and thank you to the program committee and your leadership for inviting me. You guys don't fire them after I'm done today, okay? Because they're working really hard on your behalf, and they don't know what I'm going to say, so they're not responsible, all right? I'm fully responsible for my own commentary today. But I do want to talk about this idea, if my guys want to turn on the screen, this idea of what it means to move toward a social an ethic of social justice in information. Now, I'm at a communications school now, and it's so interesting when you hop disciplines. Many of you know this, when you go from like one industry to another. It's very similar in academia when you go from one field to another. I have all these great stories about, I came out of an information school. I actually went to the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign to the information school there for school. And then I worked in the information studies at UCLA, and that's really our core field for library and information science, and we know all the things. And then you go to a comm school, and you hear things in a faculty meeting like, hey, you guys, we need to get on top of like copyright and the public domain because it's a new hot area. And then you're like, no, it's not. No, it's not. I just want to, don't do that. Okay, so we're on top of a lot of things, but some things we're not on top of still, or there are still things that we can do. And so today I thought that maybe I could talk with you a bit about, what does it mean to move toward make a case an ethic of social justice and information? And I think this is especially important for people who are in publishing because I see you as the critical gatekeepers of knowledge. And so I'm going to make a case for you today as best I can. And I know some of these things that I'm saying, you're going to feel like I already know this and I'm speaking to the choir, but it doesn't hurt for us to kind of engage in these conversations. And I'll tell you that I was really inspired to sit and listen in today on the session at 1:30 on diversity and inclusion, which was standing room only, and the hotel had to go get more chairs, and they're like, I don't understand, because no one ever goes to the diversity session, so we didn't know to bring double the chairs. So I want to congratulate you on having an interest in that and for really taking seriously the kinds of concerns that we talk about in those type of sessions. So I'm going to do things a little bit differently today than I typically do. Two of you here who are familiar with my work, and Charlotte's one of them, and that's because we went to school together, so she can't help but know. But I'm going to try to do less about my research and more about the provocations that we need to be thinking about broadly around publishing, scholarly publishing, and certainly as an academic, I'm deeply invested in that. I'd like to say that we're doing a bit of a stream of consciousness, which is something only a native Californian can say. And so sometimes when I'm in the Midwest, people are like, stream of consciousness, what are you doing? But what I mean by that is we're going to just try to think through some ideas, and I want you to stay with me because some of these ideas might be new and some of them might be uncomfortable. One of the other things I want to do is kind of just locate where I am in the field. So my work is primarily concerned with critical race and gender as it intersects with digital media and technologies. So for those of you who love Google, you'll be happy to know I'm not going to spend my time with you talking about Google, which is what I usually do. And that sometimes leaves people with hurt feelings. We'll talk a bit, though, about what it means to cede more and more of our space to large private corporations, and maybe we can rethink some of the ways that social justice and an ethic of caring can be undermined by the continued shrinkage of the public sphere and of the public good. And for me, this includes public research libraries in particular and university presses, which we know are under incredible amounts of stress. All right, so what do I want to say to you? Let's just say that one of the things that is important is that I also named that I, for many years, have been the only Black woman, untenured person anywhere I have worked. And I think that this is interesting. I hadn't thought about it until I was being interviewed for your newsletter and your blog before I came into the session today. And I was thinking about my own experiences, which really are completely like a unicorn. They don't make any real sense because one of the things that we see is that there's often kind of that one person who's hired into a department or into an organization that's going to solve it solve the diversity issues, solve the social justice issues. I've often been kind of thought of as the person who's supposed to be the only doing that work. But it really takes institutional commitment and cultural shifts, and that's some of the things that I want to talk about with you. Now, it was a university press, in fact, that gave me my first kickoff. And so I just want to acknowledge that some of the ideas today come from an article that I co-wrote with Sarah Roberts for Johns Hopkins University Press through its publication Library Trends. And that was really a great opportunity for us to, put pressure, I'd say, on the field to think about the topics of social justice. And in that paper, we argue that the field should broaden to place library and information students and faculty in dialogue with contemporary issues of social inequality and injustice whenever possible. And so I'm going to take up some of that today. Also in that work, we outlined some core definitions about social justice that we believe are directly linked to liberation from systemic oppressive racism and gender disparity, which are really critical intersectional social problems in the United States and beyond. And I know that those of us who come out of the field of libraries or information professions broadly like to think of ourselves as apolitical or neutral. I still get students, I don't know why they sign up for my class, and they think they just want to be helpful and neutral and information brokers, and then I mess that up for them because that's not what we're doing. Okay, so our work is deeply political, even if we don't think that it is. And I'm going to try and share with you a few ways that might make that more visible. Now, one of the things that Sarah and I have talked about in our work is that we consider social justice to be a core manifestation of both social responsibility and diversity, and argue that it's through social justice praxis, which is action and advocacy, that both of these values can be enacted professionally. In other words, to be socially responsible is to advocate for social justice and to act for a diverse field bolstered by multiple forms of knowing, especially knowing from the margins of our society. One of the main arguments we make in our work is that over the past 10 years or more, the values of both social responsibility and diversity within the culture at large have been highly contested, shifting and meeting due to dilution by neoliberal discourses and, of course, by the broader political climate that we're living in. Within the context of our field, which I'm, LIS, maybe I'll use that as a catch-all today for talking about the broad range of scholarly knowledge management. In our field, race remains just one of several intellectual blind spots, to coin Wayne Wiegand, related to these principles of social responsibility. And in this shift, Sarah and I argue that the concept of social justice has often been softened or even replaced wholesale with concepts that are less threatening to the status quo and that do not mandate praxis or action. Indeed, the result of this dilution is concepts that are really hard to understand and that really often reframe diversity as an individual experience or an individual set of actions rather than an institutional or collective commitment. And I think this is something that we're going to spend a little bit of time with today. In the session earlier on diversity and inclusion, it was interesting to hear one of the speakers say that diversity has become kind of a catch-all word that means everything. And, I'm here to say I'm from the 90s, y'all, and it actually doesn't mean everything. It kind of means something. In fact, I remember when I was, I'm super old, so it's fine. We've established that I'm actually from before the 90s, but I came of age in a significant way in the 90s, in the early 90s. And I remember when we used to use words like talking about marginalization, oppression, racism, sexism as defining features of exclusion. They were exclusion and homophobia. Those were the markers by which people experienced exclusion. And I remember watching the transformation of those words into a generic word like diversity, so that we don't really know what we're talking about sometimes. In fact, I was seen on Twitter acting out recently, where I said, which I like to do, where I said, you know, if my book had been called Algorithms of Diversity, it just really wouldn't have had the right ring like Algorithms of Oppression. We might not have known what in fact we're talking about when we use diversity as kind of a catch-all phrase that, again, bolsters these intellectual blind spots, if you will. And so I think we should spend a little bit of time with that. For example, diversity within the context of the so-called post-racial era has also been deployed in calls for the inclusion of everyone in ways that directly undermine and erase the specific naming of social injustices that are intersectionally and inextricably racialized, gendered, or based on class. And of course, Christine Pauli, who's a really important scholar from the University of Wisconsin at Madison, has helped us understand how, you know, when we talk about diversity, for example, she says, you know, we're not talking about the knitters, that we don't have enough knitters. Do you understand what I'm saying? I mean, we could say maybe we don't have enough dog people. I'm willing to go with that because there are a lot of cats in LIS. But when we're talking about diversity, that's not what we're talking about. And Christine Pauli is, you know, back in 2006 was talking about this. Without a clear understanding of what we mean when we say words like diversity, we cannot directly intervene or make sense of the framework of social justice within which that word came into political meaning. And we will have trouble explicitly unpacking the concept of diversity as a direct intervention in racialized inequality and injustice. It's here that I argue that the likelihood of co-optation of meanings and positive intent embedded within the notions of social responsibility and diversity are really, truly at risk. So here you have, you know, me and Google, we have a relationship, and I'm always going to Google to see what sense-making they're doing about certain concepts, because this is where the majority of the public is going when they're trying to do sense-making. And so a new buzzword around diversity is cognitive diversity, which some of you may or may not be familiar with. And the vice president of Apple recently got in a bit of trouble and resigned over this idea of cognitive diversity being the most important type of diversity that there is. And cognitive diversity basically argues that 3 people here, who weirdly all happen to be white, they think differently from each other, and therefore that we have diversity in that. So that is no. That's a no, everyone, okay? I'm just going to tell you right now, I'm here to tell you that is a no-go. This is not, I mean, it's preposterous because no 2 people, not even twins, are having the same thoughts, all right? So this is where we see this kind of dilution and meaninglessness start to emerge and be made real. I could have shown you the whole first page of search results on cognitive diversity, which are you know, articles from Psychology Today and Forbes and all kinds of interesting new pseudo-scientific research studies that prove that this is a real thing. And I guess I'm just here to tell you that it's not. All right, so you got that. You got that. That's one takeaway. Now, what I think we need truly are engaged academics and practitioners, particularly in the realm of controlling knowledge dissemination, who can articulate and enact visible commitments to social justice on campuses, in the academy writ large, and in the broader culture. Social justice as a framework for scholarly publishing and knowledge dissemination might begin with greater inclusion of courses, training and research on race, which includes studies of whiteness. It might include gender, sexuality, and oppression in the training of those who come into the field of publishing. But it certainly cannot have impact without these concepts finding wide distribution and uptake, such that they have impact on our society to generate true inclusivity, not based on individualism, but upon structural interventions that have kept racial oppression, for example, intact since the founding of the United States. I'm going to give you some really depressing news, which is that new studies have come out talking over the last 5 or 7 years about the racial wealth gap, for example, in the United States. and how, if we continue on the same trajectory that we were under during the Obama administration, not even under the current administration, it will take well over 400 years for us to close the racial wealth gap if we do not have dramatic intervention. And this is why I say these things cannot be solved at the level of feelings and consciousness of individuals. They really have to be about policy and systemic change. In 2001, feminist LIS scholar Hope Olson demonstrated the mechanisms and functions of what she described as the power to name through various types of information representations in organizational schemata, typically to the detriment of people of color, particular ethnic groups, women, and non-Christians. In her work, Olson explicitly interrogates whether the library catalog, for example, can be a neutral space and provides evidence of the detrimental consequences of categorizing or naming information resources in aberrant opposition from a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant male-centric norm. And of course, this is the foundation of our fields through which publishing and whose knowledge gets to be legitimated, whose knowledge gets to be published. And so we're going to talk about that for a minute. Jonathan Ferner, who's the chair of information studies at UCLA back in 2007, extended this critique of Olson's by examining the Dewey Decimal System using critical race theory, and he documented the hegemonic ways that the Library of Congress classification systems are explicitly racist and reinforce oppressive and socially unjust relations. Both of these writings are essential to discussing power and social responsibility in the realm of knowledge practice and could extend to the many things you design and implement in the field of scholarly publishing, which include metadata, findability, and preservation. Certainly, social justice is central to archival studies, and scholars like Michelle Caswell, Anthony Dunbar, Ann Gilliland, and others have been major contributors to pushing us in new directions. Professor Caswell, for example, in her work on symbolic annihilation in the archives, symbolic annihilation being the total erasure through simply not collecting and not maintaining records on marginalized people, is a wake-up call that exemplifies how hegemony operates within the field. We might ask, who is symbolically annihilated by the press? Sanford Berman, Hope Olson, Todd Hanma have all been central to demonstrating how classification systems or knowledge systems reinforce systemic oppression and the importance of diversifying the field of knowledge management as a practice. But we know that it is not just the catalogers who are impacting these matters of erasure or misrepresentation. The gatekeeping function of publishing is fundamental to the issues of social justice. Scholarly publishing, then, is a critically important dimension of knowledge proliferation in societies around the world. And this work has significant implications that we know are fundamentally embedded with values. Thus, the very notion of social justice in scholarly publishing is a direct response to how the classification and dissemination of knowledge has never been a neutral project. It is often working in broader contexts of nation building and, to a larger degree, of cultural domination. Knowledge and its dissemination is a social construct with a variety of attendant values that are privileged, which I can see from topics from this conference many of you are examining with great care. Now, the idea of knowledge classification and its role in maintaining cultural hierarchies is not new. Nicholas Hudson of the University of British Columbia's work on the origins of racial classification in the 18th century, which you may recall was, of course you recall, because you recall Nicholas Hudson immediately when I say that name. This idea, though, of racial categorization and hierarchies was a highly scholastic and scientific project at one time in our society. It's actually the basis of later projects like eugenics. Hudson suggests that during the Enlightenment, Europeans began to construct imagined communities, to cite Benedict Anderson's term. He says, quote, "The mental image of a community of like-minded individuals sharing a general will or a common national soul was made possible by the expansion of print culture, which stabilized national languages and gave wide access to a common literary tradition. Classification schemes that are part, and of course publishing, is part of the scientific approach to understanding people and societies, and it holds the power biases of those who are able to propagate such systems. The invention of print culture accelerated the need for information classification schemes, for example, which were often developing in tandem with the expansion of popular, scholarly, and scientific works. So here it is that we are not just in the field, of course, of scholarly publishing, but also commercial publishing, really at the epicenter of knowledge diffusion in our society. And this is one of the reasons why I think it's so important for us to understand the many dimensions and implications of this work. Now, if you take this to the digital and kind of our corollary place where online publishing is happening, which I argue in my work is Google search, and we could extend that to YouTube, which is, again, the place where you might say there's uncurated publishing happening on a regular basis. This was some of the work that led me to thinking about how important it is that we think about how information is disseminated widely in our society. So when I first started doing work that led to the book, I first did keyword searches on racialized and gendered identities. So my first kind of foray into thinking about this was when I got the results back on the searches of the keywords Black girls. Now, what was happening for many years when you did a keyword search on the phrase Black girls, you were kind of bombarded with pornography or highly sexually objectifying and exploitive content that stood as the proxy, the meaning making for who Black girls were, because here you can see you don't have to add the words porn or sex to Black girls to get this kind of content. Black girls just became synonymous with pornography and sexual exploitation. And so for many years I was collecting and writing about this type of phenomena, and this extends to Asian girls and Latina girls still to this day. And while Google quietly makes some tweaks, there are many, many examples of failures to be represented fairly and properly without misrepresentation or without large commercial industries like the porn industry or other industries taking ownership over people's ideas and their identities. Now, as we're doing work in digital systems and on the web, we can see and understand the power relations embedded in text. And one of the things that's been, I'll say disheartening because that's not a cuss word, but I'll just say that it's not been good to see libraries in particular trying to replicate what a company like Google is doing or Yahoo is doing, right? To try to adopt the commercial practices that are always decontextualized. One of the things that I think is so important about publishers and publishing and librarians is that we have an opportunity to provide more context for information and for knowledge, and rather than having it be kind of disassociated. And so these are some of the things that I think we want to consider, especially for those of you who are designing the technical backbones for your presses. Well, I often have students who want to go into some type of IT practice, but they don't want to talk about race or gender. And that makes it really difficult then for them to understand the kinds of output of their systems. Now, traces of previous works defining the scientific classification of people, I mean, this idea of Black girls as pornified objects or Latinas or Asian women, this is not new. These histories are really embedded in the classification of Native peoples and people of color as savage, and claims about Europeans as a superior race, which were based on prior notions of peoples and nations who began to emerge and be codified in the 18th century. Extensive histories have been written of how racial classification emerged in the 18th and 19th centuries in North America as a paradigm of differentiation that would support the exclusion of Native and African people, for example, from social and political life. And if you want more about this and a more recent and modern understanding of racial hierarchies in the United States, predicated upon kind of a black-white, European, African racial binary. I strongly recommend that you read Dr. Vilna Treitler's The Ethnic Project, and Stanford University gets a shout out for that right now. So we thank you for putting this work out. This work has actually been very important in sociology and African American studies. Now, by the 19th century, the processes involved in the development of racial classification stood to mark biological rather than cultural difference. And it was codified to legally deny rights to, and property ownership and citizenship. These historical practices undergird the formation of racial classification, which are both assumed and legitimated in our many knowledge systems. Without an examination of the historical forces at play in the development of such systems, the replication and codification of people and of indigenous and African descent into the margins goes uncritically examined. And I would add many more ethnicities that have integrated into American society or not been allowed to integrate. This process can be seen in knowledge organizations that both privilege and subordinate through information hierarchies like catalogs and classification systems. So we too are implicated in the organization of people, and we should be critiqued for practices that perpetuate power by privileging some sectors of the society at the expense of others. That, to me, is a more realistic way of talking about diversity, is when we think about histories of marginalization, histories of exclusion. Those histories didn't happen just through people's feelings. Those happened through policy and cultural and organizational practice in every sphere of our society. So if we think we're going to intervene at the level of our feelings that we might be challenged to address in, say, a diversity training, that actually is not necessarily going to change the systemic cultures of all of the major institutions of our society, particularly the institutions that are responsible for communicating about difference and people and nations and genders and so forth. Now, many Americans do not understand how the logics of subhumanization are deeply tied to policies that denied human and civil rights to Black people on the basis of the fact that they were, in fact, more like monkeys and apes than they were human. Indeed, they are no laughing matter for many of us, and I would say especially Valerie Jarrett right now. This, to me, is in a context of people not understanding these long, sordid histories of racialization and racist ideology in the United States. Traditional knowledge and organization systems are an important part of understanding the landscape of how publishing has inherited and continues biased practices in current system design and dissemination. Opportunities abound for the interdisciplinary publishing to extend more deeply into cultural and feminist studies, because those social science fields provide powerful and important social context for information about people that can help reframe how information about people is organized and made available. So here, this is without any kind of knowledge basis, what's the big deal about calling Black people apes or monkeys? And of course, those of us who work on university campuses, every year, there's always, Halloween is like the white knuckle holiday for most professors in the university, where we are holding on for our lives, because we know it is only a matter of seconds as we approach the Halloween season that the blackface parties and the dressing up as various cultures in costumes is about to come forward. And every year students say they don't understand what the big deal is. They can't distinguish between blackface as a racist practice that has a deep history of making people of African descent subhuman in the popular culture, and they can't understand that dressing up as Pocahontas is actually deeply offensive. And so this is where, again, we have to think about the role that knowledge dissemination more broadly, wider, deeper, must have in our society. And I think about this in the context of my own work and how Google, for example, has displaced other forms of evidence-based knowledge making, and how dangerous, quite frankly, I think that is in our society. Now, The adoption of critical race theory as a stance in the field, which I argue for consistently in my work, would mean examining the beliefs about the neutrality and objectivity of the entire field with which we're engaged, and moving toward an undoing of racist knowledge management practices. Such a stance would be a major contribution that could have impact on the development of new approaches to organizing and accessing knowledge about marginalized group. So let me just take a quick poll. How many of you at some point in your career had to take a course for a whole semester on the history of racism and sexism in the United States? Okay, one person, and it's Kaysen, and she invited me, you guys, so that's not it. Okay, so this is what I mean, that how can we do our work when we kind of don't know how our work is situated in these histories? And this is one of the reasons why Sarah Roberts and Diana Asher and I from UCLA, they're from UCLA, got together to develop the Information Ethics and Equity Institute. It was just so that we could provide more knowledge for people who are in the professions, because unless you come take a class from us, you're really not going to get a chance to kind of go deeper in some of these conversations. So what has primarily been missing from the discussion about scholarly publishing are the issues of representation that are most often researched in the fields of African American studies, gender studies, communications, and increasingly digital media studies. Information organization is a matter of socio-political and historical processes that serve particular interests. This is where consistent professional development in the field of scholarly publishing around these issues could be transformative. And I can tell you that many students I've taught in the past who were interested in scholarly knowledge management were explicitly not interested in issues of race, class, and gender or power circulate per, and it's very difficult sometimes to make a connection between these issues and their interests in scholarly publishing. Arguably, if education is based in evidence-based research and knowledge is a means of liberation in our society, then the types of knowledge that widely circulate provide a crucial site of investigation. How oppressed people are represented or misrepresented is an important element of engaging in efforts to bring about social, political, and economic justice. All right, so let's just say a little bit here. I mean, one of the things about scholarly publishing is that it can operate in a paradigm that's different from commercial publishers who will compromise any type of ethical stance of commitment in order to make money. Take, for example, Milo Yiannopoulos, who received a commitment. He received a $250,000 book deal. I'm just throwing out there, if anybody wants to give me a book deal like that, I'm not going to embarrass you, okay? All right, so he was given a book deal with Simon & Schuster, which was later rescinded, to spew racist, sexist vitriol to the public. In the commercial framework, these values that are the opposite of generating an inclusive, socially just, and fair society free from oppression, are the ultimate commodity. As the commercial sphere expands and exerts phenomenal influence over our knowledge and information needs through multinational digital media platforms and consolidated media conglomerates, we will continue to see the most titillating personalities and voices rise to the top, because racism and sexism sell in the United States, and it's big business. Resisting the continued corporatization and neoliberal commercial approach to knowledge dissemination is an important intervention. So the work that scholarly publishers do, just by virtue of existing, is an important intervention. We need engaged academics and practitioners who can articulate and enact visible commitments to social justice, and we need to be thinking about how we can have our work reach broader audiences. I love to tell this anecdote, and Eileen Kalish is going to kill me because she's just like, stop telling the story. I know she is. She hasn't said it to me, but I know that's how she feels. She's at NYU Press, and she's my editor for Algorithms of Oppression, and I remember saying to her, okay, listen, girl, this book, it's going to be called Algorithms of Oppression. And she was like, no, it's not, because nobody even knows what an algorithm is. This was back in 2012 when we first started working together. And I was like, no, they're going to know, because we're going to be on Bill Maher. We're going to get on The Daily Show. And she was like, is this woman insane? I mean, she was just like, I don't even understand what you're talking about, because that's not what we do here at NYU Press. And I dare say most presses are not trying to like book academics on The Daily Show. Okay, so the point is, though, that here we go, fast forward, the book comes out and everybody knows what an algorithm is now. And part of this is because it takes a long time for work to come out. It threw a scholarly, it's fine, it's a different conversation for a different day. You heard me say 2012, and it's 2018 right now. So it's cool. I mean, some of that's on me. It's fine. All right. But the thing of this is we've got to figure out how our work, I mean, it takes like your whole life. You miss all the good things in life because you're hunkered down writing a book, and then, it's a bestseller, I guess, if 500 people read it, which is not it, okay? So we got to work on that together, because that's not quite the right ratio of impressions that academics want to have for our work. And I know all of us don't write about things that could be taken up by the public, but I will say that many people can be and are increasingly called upon to be experts to do sense-making work in our society by journalists. And so the role, again, of learn from being supported and having our work translated by journalists is really important. One of the things I've learned from over the years from my own research on Google and its misrepresentations of women and people of color is that a demographic or pipeline approach is consistently argued as to why Silicon Valley, for example, consistently fails people of color. And so I was interviewed, I don't know, maybe a year and a half or so ago, a couple years ago, about Snapchat and its yellow face filter and how this could happen, for example. Now, the assumption here, based on Snap's unwillingness to report out its hiring numbers on underrepresented workers, is akin to other tech companies, and I would dare say scholarly publishers' approaches. And the argument and strategy is simple. In fact, it's too simple. It goes, if you hire more people of color into a field, it will automatically translate into fixing the historical inequities. It will become diverse. Indeed, this has been the political and social approach to addressing racial and gender inequality in society. Bringing more of the other, and they will solve our problems. They will correct our course. They will right the wrongs of the past as we move toward the future. And one of my challenges to Silicon Valley, which I certainly extend to the academy, is that placing the onus for solving the problems of erasure, the issues of inequality and marginalization, the underpublishing of women, people of color, and other marginalized identities, is that it places enormous responsibility on those who have been traditionally excluded to create the remedies by simply the virtue of putting their living, breathing body on the line and in the space. No matter that being in these spaces can be tremendously damaging and harmful, as the erasures and aggressions and complacency among those who are overrepresented persist despite our presence in these places. Simply diversifying the pipeline and hiring marginalized people is not an intervention, at least it's not enough of one, but it is helpful. It's even more helpful when people with tacit and intellectual commitments to social justice are put in management and leadership positions, not hired as tokens to lead unfunded and under-supported diversity programs. And while we're on this topic of leadership, let me call attention to an emerging leader that embodies, she's not even really emerging, she's just a leader. To me, I certainly follow her. She's someone who embodies a commitment to social justice in publishing. And this is my colleague, Charlotte Rowe, who's here in the front row. She's in the second seat, so you guys can find her right after. She's a scholarly communications librarian at the University of San Francisco, and she recently wrote a wonderful piece for ACRL, College and Research Libraries News, that details many great strategies for enacting policy in scholarly publishing and that supports diversity. I hope you'll all look for her and for her work during this conference and read it, because I think she has a clear understanding of the many attendant issues of broadening representations of people of color in library publishing. Shout it out for Charlotte. All right. You guys, I'm on slide 11 and I only have 15. Okay, so just want to check in. So stay with me, okay? All right. All right. Moving forward and shifting gears slightly, the question then becomes a matter, in my mind, of what does it mean to take more than one's fair share, to knowingly overproduce and overpublish and maintain a monopoly status on white and/or male knowledge. This is where I radically depart from the liberal approaches to addressing the unmet needs of those who are marginalized, which takes no account for the overmet needs of the majority. And so it is here in the confusion, in the confusion of the post-racial moment, which is not, we're not post-racial, I guess. We're all clear on that now, right? Okay, we're totally racial, I guess. I don't know, we're not that. where the rhetoric of the end of racial inequality and the embracing of particular forms of diversity from the classroom to the previous Obama White House, that we might look more closely at knowledge dissemination and the role scholarly publishers play in silencing intersecting racial and gendered material, particularly when that material seeks to redress knowledge erasures and vacuums. Diversity in the context of the so-called post-racial era has been deployed in calls for the inclusion of everyone in ways that directly undermine and erase the specific naming of social injustices that, again, are intersectionally and inextricably racialized, gendered, or based in class. Without a direct intervention in publishing and dissemination that anchors these core values in a call for social justice and that explicitly unpacks diversity, again, we really are missing the mark. We are underperforming in creating remedies. Now, there's a deep literature that includes discussions of class, the racial wealth gap, histories of racialization in the U.S., and the effects of neoliberal economic policy on the privatization of information and the erosion of the public sphere that we must read. And I think we must remain vigilant in incorporating this knowledge into our work, not as an aside, but because libraries, archives, museums, and publishers, among other information organizations, are working through the intended consequences of these public and economic policy decisions. Understanding the shifting economic regime and concepts of racialization in the distribution of resources and the shift toward and away from material that brings this type of research into relief is an intervention. We could publish more work that, when I say we, I'm not a publisher, but just accept me for the moment. We need to intervene by publishing more material that helps us again. I mean, when there was a new study that just came out of the UK about 3 or 4 weeks ago now that predicts that by world's wealth, 2030, 2/3 of the world's wealth will be owned by the 1%, the top 1%. 2/3 of the world's wealth. How do we make sense of that? What role are we going to play in sharing knowledge and research about what's happening and how it might be different? If there were ever a group of people that could be active, meaningful participants in doing sense-making and putting sense-making work into the world, it's the group of people in this room. And so I need you to know that that we're in this together. We can write, but it has to be made visible. And it has to be made visible beyond the 300 people that make it an academic bestseller. Do you understand what I'm saying? It's important. All right. So in closing, I'd like to offer up a complex example of how the academy and our scholarly materials are tied to politics and power. You may recall that a couple of years ago, student protests on college campuses led to calls for increased support for students of color, but one particular request became a matter of national policy that led to a threat to the Library of Congress's budget in the summer of 2016. In February of 2014, a coalition of students at Dartmouth College put forward the Plan for Dartmouth's Freedom Budget, Items for Transformative Justice at Dartmouth, which was known as the Freedom Plan, which included a line item to ban the use of the phrase illegal aliens, illegal immigrants, wetback, and any racially charged term on Dartmouth-sanctioned programming materials and locations. The plan also demanded that the library search catalog system shall use undocumented instead of illegal in reference to immigrants. Lisa Pete, reporting for Library Journal, noted, quote, "The replacement of the subject heading was the culmination of a 2-year grassroots process that began when Melissa Padilla, class of 2016, first noticed that what she felt were inappropriate search terms while researching a paper on undocumented students at Dartmouth's Baker Berry Library in 2013. While working with Research and Instruction Services librarian Jill Barron, Padilla told Library Journal she realized that nearly every article or book she looked at was categorized with the subject heading, illegal aliens. Now, the Dartmouth College librarians became deeply engaged in petitioning the Library of Congress. According to Pete, quote, Barron, DeSantis, and Research and Instruction Services librarian Amy Witzel proposed that the students gather documentation to prove that, quote, illegal aliens, end quote, is not a preferred term, and to find evidence that better terms, such as undocumented immigrant, which was their initial suggestion for a replacement because they were in common use. At that point, News organizations such as the Associated Press, USA Today, ABC, the Chicago Tribune, and the LA Times had already committed not to use the term illegal to describe an individual. Though successful in 2015, their case to the Library of Congress gained traction, and librarian and professor Tina Gross at St. Cloud State University began organizing caucuses and committees in the American Libraries Association, including the Subject Analysis Committee, Social Responsibilities Roundtable, and Reforma, which advocates for library services for Latinos and those who speak Spanish. Social media campaigns ensued, organized under the Twitter hashtags hashtag drop the word and hashtag no human being is illegal. By March 29, 2016, Dartmouth College's student-led organization, the Coalition for Immigration Reform and Equality, and the Dreamers announced in a press release that after a 2-year battle in partnership with campus librarians and the ALA, that the Library of Congress will replace the term illegal aliens with non-citizens and unauthorized immigrants in its subject headings. Now, this struggle over reclassifying undocumented immigrants was part of a long history of naming members of society as problem people. In many ways, this effort to eliminate illegal alien was similar to the ways that Jewish people were once classified by the Library of Congress as, quote, the Jewish question, later to be reclassified in 1984 as Jews, and Asian Americans were once classified as, quote, yellow peril. Control over identity is political and often a matter of public policy. Almost as soon as a successful change was approved, House Republicans introduced H.R. 4926 on April 13, 2016, also known as Stopping Partisan Policy at the Library of Congress Act, sponsored by Representative Diane Black, who's a Republican from Tennessee. And in essence, the bill threatened the library's budget, and Black suggested that the effort to change the LOC the subject heading, the LCSH, was a matter of caving to the whims of left-wing special interests and attempting to mask the grave threat that illegal immigration poses to our economy, our national security, and our sovereignty. And I'll tell you right now, today, we can read stories, horrific stories of what's happening to immigrants in our country. And I think that we have to ask ourselves again about the relationship between the normalization of othering and our role in intervening upon that. There is a pivotal relationship between information and users that's dependent upon human understanding. It is this point that I want to emphasize in the context of information dissemination. Information provided to a user is deeply contextualized and stands within a frame of reference. For this reason, it's important to study the social context of those organizing information and the potential impacts of the judgments inherent in the informational organization process. That's the judgments y'all hold. That's what I'm talking about. What are the judgments? What's the taste-making that we're doing in our practices? And I think, these things are kind of fundamental to the origins of our field of information science, and certainly to information retrieval and knowledge information management. So let me just then shift here to things that I think we can do, because my talks are always a downer, and they really need to be followed with like an open bar reception. I'm clear about that, okay? So I just want you to know, I know. This is really bad when I give talks in the morning at like 9 or 10 o'clock, and then people are just like desperate to get to the bar. So, all right, so you just a few minutes stands between me and that. All right, so what are some things that we can do? Well, first, I think we need to make scholarly research visible to the public faster and more broadly. And that means we need to get more creative together, again, about having evidence-based knowledge circulate maybe as powerfully as disinformation circulates on the internet. These are the kinds of things that you all hold a tremendous amount of power in thinking through. And I know people are sitting here going like, no, girl, you don't understand my job. That's not my job. I don't know how to do that, or I'm too low level an employee to intervene like that. But I'll tell you that we are in this together, and we have got to be creative, because we are living in a time where the public is increasingly incapable of distinguishing disinformation and propaganda from real knowledge. So if you think there isn't a role for us to play in shoring up democracy, then you really misunderstand how people like me value your work. It's crucial, and it has to be beyond selling a few hundred books. We have to get more creative than putting all the knowledge behind a paywall. that the public can't access. But that's a different talk for a different day. All right. We need to also be thinking about building repositories and platforms that belong to the public. So one of the things I really argue for in my work, certainly in the new book, is that so much of our sense-making knowledge is in privately held corporate advertising platforms, which is what Google Search is. It's an advertising platform. It's what Facebook is. It's an advertising platform. And so many people go to Google and to Facebook as their first go-tos for sense-making, for knowledge, for information. And we have to figure out how we're going to compete with that. One of the things I often say is that, it's insufficient to think about regulating the kind of social media and Silicon Valley tech spaces while simultaneously taxpayers vis-a-vis our elected representatives defund public education, defund public universities, defund public media, defund public libraries. There's no alternative to the commercial advertising space. The Holmes Report just issued their latest, they do research on public relations, and they showed that they predict in the next 10 years the public will not be able to tell the difference between earned media, which is work that journalists do, and PR. So now the press releases will serve as a proxy for investigative journalism? These are the kinds of, or scholarship? These are the kinds of things that are at stake. And I think we've got to get involved. And if anybody wants to work with me on thinking about how to create more public interest repositories, I'm game. We also need to retrain ourselves on how to resist colorblind, racist, and sexist practices. If you want to talk about that, you can call me, because we got a lot of work to do. I'm just going to leave it there. But I will tell you that there's nothing that will be a more powerful intervention than education. And you're talking to a person who, is I'm atoning for my sins, having spent a 15-year career in advertising and marketing by becoming an academic. So I will tell you that, forgive me, y'all. It's really important that we not give up hope that education serve as a powerful intervention in our society. And of course, understanding some of these histories and our own practices is important. And of course, we can never, ever give up on trying to work on these things. In this sense, as I hearken back to the platform that a library publisher gave me for my early work, Johns Hopkins University Press, and that my amazing editor, Eileen Kalish, who I told you about at NYU Press, gave me for my new book, Algorithms of Repression, that I must argue for robust dissemination of evidence-based knowledge. We need fairness in peer review that doesn't undermine scholars of color and women. We need stronger support systems from scholarly publishers to disseminate our work as we speak truth to power and work to battle disinformation through our research. We cannot let commercial search engines, for example, or digital propaganda overtake the possibility for knowledge and truth to circulate powerfully in service of social, economic, and political relations and practices that are just, benevolent, nonviolent, and foster equitable life chances and quality of life across the globe. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Does anyone have any questions?
I love your claps. Thank you. Okay, who has questions? Come on. I might have to take my jacket off. It's getting kind of hot up here, you guys. Don't judge me.
I don't actually expect you to be able to answer this, but the thing that kind of sits in my mind that I struggle with is the notion of gatekeeping altogether. Mm-hmm. So our role as publishers, one of the big value adds that we bring is the gatekeeping.
Yes.
So where do we start? How do we address it? What do we do? Help.
Okay, so one of the things that I use these new phrases for some of you, like over-representation, is another way to think about like examining your catalog and whose voices over time have had more power and support and whose haven't. And we can correct the course, right? I think that the dominant paradigm is about including, adding to, and not questioning the fundamental basis of overrepresentation. So I think that's something that is, you could do that on Monday.
We have microphones here, and do we have any questions from the virtual attendees?
They're talking to me on Twitter right now. I can feel it. It's going to be a long flight home responding, but that's okay. That's another place.
So one of the things, the trends here at the meeting, which I tweeted about, that I've been seeing actually in publishers is machine learning and artificial intelligence for publishers.
Yes.
And has there been a history of that going wrong?
That's Charlotte, everyone. So now you know who she is. And she's just like lobbing a softball at me. Okay, so we know. I didn't talk a lot about my research specifically today because there's so many of my talks online that you can see if you're interested. But yes, the use of, I'll just say kind of in a headline way, that one of the things about training machines and machine learning and artificial intelligence is that it is being trained on, of course, biased data, biased histories, racist and sexist histories of creating a baseline, right, of fact or of truth. And that then becomes the basis through which machines are trained. So, of course, if you can easily train, and pretty much a lot of people are doing right now, training their algorithms on biased data. So we know for sure that's happening. Of course, we have a broader discourse about AI and machine learning, that it is superior, that it does superior decision making than human beings can do. And this is something that I argue against vehemently in my work, which is to say that AI is actually often very crude. It's doing kind of rough sense making in times where we need very nuanced, close readings and sense making, right? So I think this is one of the things that we should be cautious about in our race to algorithmic decision-making, automated decision-making, and AI. I certainly believe, and I'm working now on my next book, which is about artificial intelligence as a human rights issue. And I think that we will be talking, and we will see much more in the years to come, in the decades to come, about AI and its relationship to our erosion of civil and human rights. And so we should think carefully about the automation. I mean, listen, if our own Library of Congress, subject headings are full of bias, which we still have a long way to go there. If that's, let's say that that's just one form of metadata that you use to inform your AI, well, what do you think is going to happen, right? So, I mean, these are, and the problem with deep machine learning is that, the idea here about deep machine learning is that machines will make these complex decisions that human beings could never make. Okay, so then how are we going to fix the machine's decisions if they're doing things we can't comprehend? I don't understand why no one is upset about this besides me right now. I mean, a lot of people are upset about it. But these are the kinds of things that we have to, again, think about as we move money and resources into these technologies. I mean, the flat out reality to me is that these ideas about machine learning and AI are creating new markets for tech companies, and for us to redistribute money into those that we might distribute otherwise into getting people on the Daily Show or something. I don't know. I don't know. No, I'm just playing. But do you see what I'm saying? It's a form of investment that could be done differently. And I think we need to think about what we're going to lose. What we want, we're at one moment, we're calling for deeper, more nuanced understanding and education in this group about ideas. And then we're going to kind of roughly, crudely outsource that to an AI. It doesn't make sense. It doesn't go together, okay? So I think, one of the things that I say in the book is that at the very moment, in the 1960s, when you have the enfranchisement of people of color and women into decision-making and managerial roles all across the kind of U.S. society, business practices, you also simultaneously have the rise of the belief that computers can make better decisions than human beings. And so it's no coincidence to me, again, that we have, as at the moment where we're trying to diversify and have more voices, we're also taking the agency from those people and putting it into machine learning and AI, and I think that's something to think about.
This is probably a simpler question, I think. I was wondering if there's been any research done about Wikipedia, because I think, like, when I think about when my kids were little, that was sort of seemed like a good place for them to go because it was supposed to be community-driven, expert checks and all, but I was sitting here thinking about what you said about overrepresentation, and is it that same group that's sort of the experts? So are like in the very beginning of education, sort of turning over our kids to a product that's probably suffering the same problems?
Sure. I mean, Wikipedia is not a replacement for a book or a course or a major. And I hope it never does become that. I mean, one of the things about, of course, many of us know the hierarchies of control and editing in Wikipedia, and that it's not exactly as democratic as maybe some people think of it as. And there are certainly huge gaps. I mean, we have, feminists, and we have wiki storming. We have all kinds of events all over the world trying to diversify Wikipedia and the knowledge representation there. And that is a struggle that is not easy to do. I think what I'm more interested in, again, because those of you, who are publishing books and articles, this is, again, where we have a stake in this. What does it mean to acculturate young people or people who are looking for information to thinking that there is one authoritative site, Wikipedia or Google, it is the truth, rather than multiple forms of knowing, right? If you take a course, for example, on a subject, you're going to read, if you take my course, you're going to read a lot. So you're going to read a lot of things, and you're going to nuance something. And you can't really do that in digital media platforms. There's not a lot of nuance. There's not a lot of context. Certainly, I think one of the biggest worries that I have is that, and I see this all the time with my students, they've been acculturated to believe that they can do a search in a digital media platform and have an answer in 0.03 seconds. And that acculturation to the notion that there is a truth, it's going to be ranked first, and you can get it instantly, is really antithetical to how education works, which it doesn't happen in 0.03 seconds. It's a process, and it's iterative, and that part is really, really important to learning and to sense-making in the world. And I think that that's what's at stake as we put more emphasis into the instant kind of knowledge access.
I think we have a question from the virtual attendees. Yeah.
Yes, Allison first, and then.
Hi. So I'm interested in exploring a little bit how you were talking about the individual versus the structural, the cultural, societal, and the micro versus the macro. In the recent posts on the Scholarly Kitchen about people of color and underrepresented groups' experiences in scholarly publishing, a few of them hit on the same theme of, I experienced this at a place that I thought I wouldn't because of the kind of publishing they do. So in that case, we're talking about organizations that are maybe, if you look at their catalog, they have been judged to be trying to right this balance, either consciously or not, but are perceived to be opening the gates and widening the gates, but the practice at the micro level of that organization doesn't seem to reflect that to these people's experience. And I don't really have a question. I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts about that.
Right. I think that same phenomena is happening everywhere. We're living in a moment where, in fact, we were having this conversation earlier today, where, every opinion is legitimate, even the racist ones at work. And I guess this is one of the reasons why, again, in a different historical moment, we had understanding about how to be, quite frankly, at work. And those things were governed by kind of our HR policies, the leadership of an organization, where we understood our behavior and our actions as doing something, not just, again, disassociated from us with no accountability or responsibility. Now, of course, we are living in a moment where people tweet and that feels like disconnected from the personal, but increasingly we see pushback on that being part of behavior. And so I think, of course, we have to just act right at work. I don't know, that just seems so simple on some level. Just don't say terrible things at work. I don't know. I can't say terrible things in my job. I'll tell you that. It's not a free-for-all, anything goes. I'm at work. I speak differently with my girlfriends when we're drinking wine. Do you know what I'm saying? It's like, so on some level, I think, all opinions are not helpful to our goals, like racist ones. I know some of my that put our own. Somebody was saying earlier to me, I appreciate that at least I know where my colleagues stand. And I'm like, I don't care where you stand. I don't actually want to be in a hostile environment at work. So if you have racist ideas, which I know some of my colleagues do, it's okay to keep it to yourself. It's really okay. And you should not feel like you're being stifled, because you can say that at home or with your friends. You don't have to say it at work, because at work, we're creating an environment where we can accomplish something. And what that means is, if our organizations are really committed to equity and we're really committed to these ideas around justice, then people might realize this isn't a good place to work if they harbor certain kinds of beliefs. I don't know. To me, this doesn't seem that difficult. Maybe I'm missing it. But I think this is how you start to create a culture and practices in a workplace environment that really is about inclusivity. Now, that doesn't mean tokenizing the Black lady that works there either. Do you know what I'm saying? Or, anyone who has a marginal identity in society. They can't just be here to occupy a seat and never have their ideas taken up, or never be in management, or never be in a position to execute on ideas that are well-informed. What my experience as a person of color, as a Black woman in the academy, is I actually have to be 3 times more prepared than others to make a case for something that I want. So oftentimes you're gonna get really well-researched ideas that come from people who are accustomed to having their ideas not taken up. So that can be a great benefit to an organization too. And that becomes part of it, creating of a new culture.
We just have time for one more question. You had one from the virtual attendees?
Okay, we have a question from Jessica, who asks, you mentioned how publishers should enhance their marketing efforts. For you as an author and an academic, what do you feel has been the most successful initiative so far?
Could you repeat the question? Because I was trying to figure out where the voice was coming from. I'm so sorry. I was just like, there we go. Okay, now, one more time.
Okay, all right. You mentioned how publishers should enhance their marketing efforts. For you as an author and an academic, what do you feel has been the most successful initiative so far?
Okay, so I have the privilege, I'm in a privileged position. I work at USC Annenberg School of Communication, so they are professional communicators and have a wonderful infrastructure of support. So they have done a lot, including from our dean, Willow Bay, through all of our professional staff, who have been good partners to the press, NYU Press, in amplifying my work. And so I've been lucky, and I don't think that that is, again, typical for most of my friends and my colleagues. So I think that the press, one thing that presses could do, again, is kind of reorient to the spheres of journalists and parts of the public who would be interested in the content of that book, rather than having an imagined community that's just of scholars and students. Because I think people do want more sophisticated, nuanced understandings of all kinds of topics. And I think there are, this is where I feel gross by saying new markets, but there are markets for a lot of different types of work, and it takes effort to do that. And, so maybe some more of the publicity needs to be in-house rather than outsourced to people. Some of the marketing could be in-house, tighter coordination to really support. A lot of academics are kind of boring and dry. Just don't tell anybody I said that. So it's not for everyone. But there are some academics who are doing work that they see as having greater relevance to the public, and they know how to communicate that, but they don't know where to go to sit down and talk to someone about it, right, to get the amplification. And that's where the press, having full-time people, can know and can help open doors and that kind of thing. And so that to me is kind of in the marketing and publicity parts of the press. That's really, really important. Even helping scholars, understand how to, build a profile. I mean, some of us work at places where to be seen as a public intellectual is to tank your career. So, we have to have, if the press values it though, then the academy might actually respond differently, because the academy loves presses, especially university presses. I mean, that's their jam. And all of us are accepted or rejected in tenure and promotion in terms of the kinds of presses that we're working with. So smaller presses, I think, that have less resources, maybe there are ways we can work collectively. We can have more kind of scholarly publishing, collectively oriented promotion of research into the world, rather than kind of leaving it on departments and individual faculty members who probably are not well trained in knowing how to do that. Let me just say one more thing while I'm here before I have to turn over the mic. I mentioned this earlier today in a conversation that was going to come out in the blog post. The relationship between smaller subfields and scholars who work in subfields that are not big mainstream, like I'm in communications now, but I'm also in African American studies, which is a smaller field in social sciences and humanities. And your partnerships with companies like Google Scholar, for example, have a real impact on people who work in smaller fields, because our work is increasingly being valued in the university by our H-index and the citation metrics and all of these things that many tenure and promotion committees are turning to Google Scholar to just kind of pull down and do the sense making of, and other citation metrics. And so this is becoming a real structural barrier for people, for example, who don't publish journal articles but maybe write books. And people who are in niche areas who might have, let's say they have 90% uptake of interest and passion for their work that's being engaged with, but it's in such a small field that it doesn't register like a big impact. But it might have a huge impact in a field. It just doesn't have bigger impact relative to other fields' numbers that can get produced. And so these are some of the kinds of things that I think presses also have to really be mindful of. And maybe we can talk more about that at some other time. And presses can do more to kind of nuance these issues of metrics that I think are ultimately serving to marginalize underrepresented voices and people in these fields. Okay. Thank you.